Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see all of you here this evening on this beautiful early fall evening to meet somebody that I've known and worked with and considered a friend for many, many years. Giles Merritt is an author, a journalist, and a founder of one of the leading think tanks in Brussels, Friends of Europe. And he's been a prominent journalist, notably with the Financial Times, but also with other media. And for several decades has been a leading voice in Brussels and in Europe on European integration, reform, and some of the dominant trends in society. You get a sense of this simply from the title of his many books, which are a dozen or so over the last 20 years. I mean, the titles almost speak for themselves. The Slippery Slope, Europe's Troubled Future, People Power, Europe's Aging Challenge, an earlier demographic study, Europe's Green Momentum, A Climate of Misinformation, Europe's Next Decade, The Case for Optimism, which I think we need more of around here, and his recent book, which is just published, Timebomb, When Aging Explodes, a warning about the economic, social, and political consequences of Europe's rapidly aging population. And for me, this book and Giles' presence here with us this evening fills a notable gap. We were speaking a few moments ago of the fact that demography as a subject has not been very fashionable for years and years. And yet today, when you read a book such as Giles, you sort of get the feeling that you need to understand the demographic changes to understand so many other issues. I mean, the most obvious one clearly is migration. And one of my bugbears, one of my personal little causes, is that the discussion in Brussels, in the European Commission and elsewhere of the migration issue is completely divorced from the discussion of demography. And yet the two are so intimate. You just have to look at the portfolios of the commissioners or look at ministers in various governments. Who is in charge of migration? Usually the minister dealing with security or internal security, police, judicial affairs, and so on. Whereas demography is a kind of soft area linked with statistics. In the last commission, there was one portfolio for democracy and demography, and another one entirely separate for migration linked to home affairs. And yet the two are so intimately connected. And I think one of the really interesting points in Giles' book, which I'm sure he will share with you this evening, is the way in which so many questions, fiscal questions, questions about intergenerational justice, questions about ecology, voting patterns, the shift towards the more demagogic and populist political parties, whether at the left or the right. Much of this can be related to demographic shifts. So for me, reading this book really got me thinking. It was one of those experiences such as at an earlier phase in my career, I was very much focused on energy. And when you focus on energy, you get the feeling that really so many other issues can be explained by issues related to energy. I get that feeling now with demography. So I think that the whole field of demography has a big future, as it were, because the challenges are enormous. And therefore, it's extremely timely to have Giles with us this evening and to have his book in the library and available to you, as it really does raise a number of the most challenging questions of this and future generations. But enough from me, and I think Giles will give us a fairly short introduction, and we want to leave as much time possible for engaging with you and for Q&A. Let me just say also to those who are following online that I would encourage you to put your questions into the chat box, and I will keep my eye on that and filter your questions into the subsequent discussion. Giles, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. much indeed. First of all, I've got a funny voice. If you don't understand something, don't hesitate to say so, and I'll either repeat it or you come and sit nearer. Um, First things first, let's stop talking about demographics. It's a sort of cozy word. We're talking about aging. We're talking about a Europe that is going to get very old. Far too many old people like me, far too few young people like you. And it's not something you can put right overnight. So it's a really big problem. Now, I've really come to listen to you because aging isn't my problem. It's your problem. It's going, it's going to dominate your professional lives. Believe me, it's going to be a real problem for you. Something that my generation created and thoughtlessly handed on to you without thinking what we were doing. And you are going to have to resolve it or at least live with it. The other thing is to admit I'm not an expert. In fact, when it comes to aging, there are no experts. There are experts in different silos. There are demographers. A lot of them are in Vienna for some reason. And then there are economists and social scientists and what have you. And the great pity is they don't talk to each other. So when writing a book, I was looking for somebody whose brains I could pick. Somewhere where there were shortcuts. Doesn't exist. Had to do the work myself. Very annoying. Okay, let's get on to aging. 3 images to bear in mind. First of all, the time bomb. It's obvious. It's ticking. It'll explode somewhere around mid-century, and it'll explode with political force. The second one, which I prefer, in fact, is that aging is a tsunami. We all know what a tsunami looks like. You can't really see it. Great swirl of water, and then suddenly it hits. And aging is like that. We all know about it. It's out there somewhere, and you can sort of sense this happening, but you can't see it. The third image I like is that of a ship of state, if you like, which you could say is Europe, and notably the European Union. Am I too close to this? Um, the ship of state, yeah, I think that's better. The ship of state is holed below the waterline. So you look at the European Union, you look at national politics, they're messy, they're to be criticised, but it all looks as if it's afloat. But as I say, thanks to aging, it's holed beneath the waterline. And it's something we all have to get our hands, our minds around. There's a paradox here. Everybody thinks we know about aging. Everybody knows Europe's getting old. It's common knowledge. Okay. So why does it not figure in political debate? If it's common knowledge, why aren't we talking about it? Well, the reason is, of course, it's a future problem that requires immediate action. Immediate action means money, means resources, means trouble for politicians. And I can't think I've ever met a politician who looked for unnecessary trouble over the horizon. But that's the reason for the paradox. Okay, I'll use the word demographic disaster. I mean, Europe and Asia are, it's no secret, huge problems. I mean, just simple thing. The average age in Europe within about 10, 15 years will be just so short of 50. 50 years ago, it was 36. By mid-century, instead of there being a quarter of the population of Europe that is over 60, it'll be a third. That's a big problem because of tax, because of where the money comes from. I mean, throughout the post-war period, you had pretty evenly a ratio of 4 tax-paying workers for each pensioner. That has now slipped roughly to 3-1. It's actually slightly below 3-1. By mid-century, it will be less than 2-1, 1.89, if I remember. I mean, who knows? But that's the Commission figure. European Commission, why aren't they saying it more loudly? Because they don't like bad news. The European Commission has never understood that bad news is their business, is their raison d'etre, and yet they persist in the European Commission in trying to hit the high notes, tell you why it's all good. But that's another discussion. Very hard, though, to keep up with the population of Europe because it's a roller coaster. From roughly the 1960s to, I think it was 2017, the European population grew very fast. It grew by 25%. So a quarter bigger than it had been in the 60s. And now it's going to plateau, but get much older. But by the time you get to 2050, slightly before, it goes down. So between now and roughly 2070, 75, Europe loses 60 million people. And it requires 60 million more pensioners. So fewer taxpayers, more people needing tax money. Some people think, you know that when I say some people think, I haven't a clue why they would think this. But some people think it's not a real problem, that Europe shrinks a bit and becomes more sinewy. The reality is that aging is the biggest threat to European integration that there has been. The problem is that the new member states of the European Union are either getting older or shrinking at a much faster rate than the richer Western Europeans. And I mean, the cornerstone of European policy for the last 30 years or so, really, since the wall came down, has been cohesion, to make the poorer former communist states stronger and therefore part of a more cohesive Europe. We'll be very lucky if we can keep that up. My bet is that you're going to need enormous transfers to countries like Bulgaria, Croatia. I mean, Bulgaria is going to shrink in population by 40%. 40%. Croatia by 25%. Romania somewhere between the two. It's a desperate scenario. and it's not part of the political discussion in Brussels, extraordinarily. Okay, so let me just, I'm going to try and go fast so that you can either ask awkward questions or I can ask you what you think. But the hot spots in the whole aging problem, it's the wealth gap. Old people have got 95% of the money, assets, property, and so on. Young people under 25 have got 5%. Young people, you will find your cost upon graduation. Your legacy is low wages because, for a variety of reasons we haven't got time to discuss, but I'd love to. Europe has been building low-wage economies. So you are going to have a low wage when housing is in disastrous short supply all over the world. But Europe, as much as America, really bad. And one of the reasons, in my opinion, why populist politicians are making such inroads into otherwise quite sensible, centrist political parties. Next hotspot, what I call the silver stranglehold. Old voters, your generation, can't be bothered to get out of bed and go and vote. My generation go to the polls and will defend tooth and claw the privileges and the wealth that they have accumulated. So until we start to mobilize the youth vote, we've got a real problem. We cannot have meaningful reform while my generation is selfishly defending the assets that it has got hold of. I mean, quite reasonably after a working life, you expect older people to be richer than young people, but not with the sort of gap widening at the rate of during the 21st century. Last thing, debts, wealth, and tax. I mean, I deal with them chapter and verse in the book. I won't bore you with them now, but they're worth looking into. I mean, the amount of debt we're building up, the degree, the polarization of wealth, and the degree not only of tax evasion, tax dodging, but also the tax needs to fund an elderly population. I mean, a hospital looking after somebody like me in healthcare terms costs 8 times what it takes to look after you. And think, I'm just the beginning of the aging problem. So we've got a ballooning healthcare problem. Now, I mean, I have solutions. I've talked now for 12 minutes. I'll go through them very quickly. But just to go quickly, we've got to take health care and care for the elderly apart. It's ridiculous to have a healthcare system that is meant to look after normally healthy people and to have that the same system that looks after people on their way out, and very expensively. We must separate the two. Childcare, it's ruinous. I mean, I know from my own children, our daughters have sort of bankrupted themselves, basically paying all their rather good salaries to healthcare, to childcare for the kids until they get into schooling. Homes, we've got to make sense of housing. And frankly, it's not rocket science. You find ways of developing old properties and modernizing them. You find ways of moving elderly people out of huge houses they don't really want to be in and turning them into flats, and so on and so forth. Gig jobs. It's ludicrous the way we've allowed the gig jobs thing to grow up, to grow and throttle labour markets. I put down genie. I expect it'll mean something to you in a week or two's time. But it's basically the working. We've got to do something about wages so low for immigrants and new entrants and people without enough skills. We've got to do something about the working poor. Taxes. The tax problem is governments. Stupid, selfish politicians who are in a race to the bottom of saying, right, we will try and entice investment with lower taxes here, there, and everywhere, thus creating open season for anybody, any big corporation or billionaire or whatever who doesn't want to pay a proper rate of tax. And it's up to the governments, and they need to be called out much more. Pensions. We need to rethink the whole thing. You won't get a pension till you're about 85 on the current showing. So I advise you to focus on pensions when you actually get into work, because if you don't do it, nobody else will. Immigration, Michael mentioned it, and it was the subject of my last book, Why We Need More Migrants. Not a book, I have to say, that enjoyed enormous success. People didn't really want to know. But we have to get real on immigration. We need the people. I don't care if they're black, brown, pink, sky blue, pink. I don't care. And they should bring Granny with them. Because if they don't bring Granny, who looks after the kids when the wife and the husband go out to work? Not something you'll hear from the politicians. I have to say, all of these policies are tough, and tough means unpopular. And you need European consensus if you're going to do them. No one national government wants to expose itself as vulnerability by being alone. But if we could get European governments to have consensus, to have a common platform, a strategy, that would be halfway to resolving the problem. A last thing, closing pitch. My book is full of incredibly facts and figures. Those are your bread and butter. Don't bother with AI. AI is as good as the question you ask, and not even then very good, in my opinion. What you need to know is what the questions are, and that involves finding out the facts for yourselves. And in my opinion, a book like mine, which is absolutely lousy with footnotes and quite a good index, is a really good shortcut to finding out what the important facts are that will basically dominate not just your working lives, but your lives, full stop.
Thank you very much for that extremely interesting and heartfelt presentation of not far too long at all. We still have an hour of these issues, which are of great concern to everybody. I would like to get the ball rolling with a couple of questions. First of all, you said in talking about the losses of population in different countries that this was mainly a problem in some of the not so new EU member states. But isn't it also a pretty dire problem in some of the older member states, especially like Italy, and for that matter, Germany, which also, I believe, is on current showing, would lose 10, 15, 20 million people by halfway through the century. And as we know, after Japan, South Korea, and recently also Chile, Italy comes fourth in terms of the average age of the population and low birth rates. So how are these large countries, which are in a way the backbone of the European Union, going to cope with this issue when populist policies are on the rise? I mean, one of your conclusions is that between now and 2050, Europe will need 100 million migrants to offset aging. But as we know, the raison d'etre, in a way, for some of these populist parties is opposition to migration, not least in Italy and in Germany, for example. So how can we square this circle also in the older member states?
It's a great question, of course. Let's begin with that 100 million. Not my figure. It came from, I guess, I don't have many political heroes, but he's one of them. Felipe Gonzalez, the Spanish Prime Minister who took Franco's Spain and turned it into modern, progressive Spain. About 12 years ago, I think, Felipe Gonzalez was given a sort of a mandate by a group of sort of wise men in Europe, former prime ministers also, to look into demographics. And he came back with a report that said between now, and it must have been about 2012 or so, he said between now and 2016, we need 100 million immigrants. The wise men who commissioned this report immediately buried it. They said, we don't want that sort of talk. So Felipe's report never really got the attention it not only deserved, but needed to have. So there we are, we have this huge gap. And in the meantime, those fertility figures, I mean, why call them fertility figures? They're not. We're now down to an average of 1.5 children per couple. In Italy, it's under 0. What is it? 0.7 or something.
Way below replaced.
It's ridiculous. And Italy isn't just the only one. I mean, I remember the Italians started saying, oh, we're a despairing nation. Well, they're not the first. The first to go will be the Baltic republics, small anyway, and exporting well-educated people at a phenomenal rate. And they will cease to exist by 2050 or so. I mean, to all intents and purposes. I mean, so much so, they might even welcome a resurge of Russians. So, bad joke. The short answer, though, is there is no answer. Every government has funded, and some have applied, subsidies to encourage more children. They've all fallen flat on their face. If you are a young couple, say, and 2/3 of your income is basically going on fixed costs, mainly rent, but also other bits and pieces. So your disposable income of two incomes is down to 1/3. There aren't many subsidies that a national government can offer that would compensate for that. So you can forget it. But it's changing the face of Europe and of European society. I mean, some, in some areas, I rather welcome it. I mean, Russia, good example. Russia never recovered from World War II. If you lose 23 million young people, the snowball starts. And now the snowball is that having been somewhere approaching 200 million people, the Russians are now down to about 140. And they're likely to be about 100 million by mid-century. And there's one group of demographers in Seattle. They're known as the Lancet team because they always publish in the Lancet Medical Journal in London. They say the Russian population will be 89 million. In other words, about the same as Germany now. So, I mean, who knows where it's going? But what we do know is there ain't no fix on fertility. You have to bring in more people. You have to recognize that we are a multiracial, multicultural society. Christian Europe is for the birds. And I mean, we're about to watch this in slow motion in the United States of America. The attack on the Latino population. We won't see it immediately, but until now, I always used to say, oh, the lucky Americans, their labor force is growing. Ours is shrinking. And I'd be prepared to put €100 on the table as a bet. Anybody in this room who could produce evidence of a growing economy with a shrinking labor force, you get my €100 because it don't exist. And we're going to find that in America, and we're already finding it in Europe.
Maybe just another couple of questions before opening up. Just staying with some of the older member states for a moment, and we're in Italy, so why not Italy? But the question is really about what is the right strategy for governments to pursue. They could try to raise the profile of the aging issue, we don't call it the demographic issue, in the name of public education, so that people would understand what the consequences are of an aging population, which might perhaps make them more open in the longer run to positive policies on migration and so on. Or they can sort of do it by stealth, because if they were to take the bull by the horns, there would be the counter reaction as well. I mean, in Italy, you've got a governing coalition, one of whose parties really made its name, Salvini, the Lega, and so on issues opposing immigration. It looks to me, I'm no expert on Italian politics, maybe others could comment, that this government is walking this sort of tightrope, knowing that part of its support comes from this sentiment, but at the same time understanding that the Italian economy is being held back by labor shortages and so on, and also by emigration from Italy. I mean, something like 190,000 Italians left the country last year. So the government is actually quietly, without talking about it very much, issuing more labor permits than I think any Italian government has done for many years, but not really talking about it very much. So, should governments be launching public information campaigns so people can understand and they can see that migration is a necessity? Or is it better for them rather quietly to get on with it without raising an issue that could turn out to be counterproductive?
I love the idea of the Meloni government producing a public information campaign that encourages more immigration. For pigs might fly. Let's start with your first bit of question, Michael. Which was, should we not be doing more about the case for older people, the mettre en valeur. Everywhere I look, the focus is on older people. In Britain, as they say in Brussels, the country I know best.
I say the country I used to know best.
Yes, yes, two elderly Brexit refugees you're looking at, actually. But in Britain and all around Europe, in fact, I've seen it. The moment anybody moves against old people, in Britain, there's been a thing about winter fuel subsidies, and then on pensions, retirement ages, rehousing, getting people to sell their house in order to finance elderly healthcare and so on. Every time somebody turns and says, "What about getting the old people to pay?" There's an uproar. Awful. Whereas anybody who says, "I think the young people can pay for this," no problem, no problem. So I invite you all, pay for me. I mean, the truth is, old people have far too much money. Of course, there are a lot of poorer people who are old. And of course, it is right to have developed social benefits and networks that look after these people. But let's means test these things. Let's differentiate between people who can afford to cough up. Let's look more closely at inheritance arrangements and taxes. Let's be more intelligent about who pays what. And let's get away from the idea that old people need special conditions, special care. Let's focus on intergenerational fairness. I mean, a good example of this I was looking at in the United States. If you're a baby boomer, roughly speaking, you will get about $1 million back from the federal system during your lifetime, usually towards the end of your lifetime. You will have put in three quarters. I don't think it's 1 million I'm thinking of. It must be 100 million. But anyway, you will have put in 3/4 of that and you will have got 100% back. Turn it around to the Generation X, even post-baby boomer, and it's the other way round. You put in far more than you get out. This is a recipe for political trouble. This is something we really have to address. And as I say, everybody thinks they know about it, so it's not worth talking about. It's because the politicians don't want to talk about it.
Well, thanks very much, Giles. Let's open up to questions and comments. You put on the table any number of issues and areas that people might like to come back on. Intergenerational justice and taxation issues related to that, pensions, the welfare state and its future, and how can it survive under these conditions, economic challenges, shrinking workforce, debt. You mentioned earlier on housing problems, immigration, a very prominent issue here. The EU's capacity to hold together with very different patterns in different member states, and perhaps also the EU's role in the world, which we didn't get to, but with a declining population and Europe accounting for an ever decreasing share of world population. Anyway, there are any number of issues. Many of them are mentioned in your book. So who would like to come in with the first question on any of these issues? Hannah? Yeah.
Before you do that, can I just ask for a show of hands? Idle curiosity. How many of you can put your hand up to say that you have voted, you have exercised your right to vote so far? Excellent. Very good.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Okay, good. We're all good. We're good. We're good Democrats. Yeah, that's why that's where they're at size. Come on. I mean, really, if you went down the road to Via dell'Unione, you might get a different answer. I don't know. But anyway, when you come in, do introduce yourself briefly, Hannah.
My name is Hannah. I'm a teaching assistant, actually. I'm wondering a little bit about the fertility politics versus migration politics debate here. So if you say there ain't no fix for fertility, so fertility politics are not an effective answer or can't be the main solution, then how are, broadly speaking, left-wing politics supposed to counter the kind of natalism rhetoric that we are encountering from the right? And specifically, how do you feel about these kind of merit-based migration solutions, these like the Canadian point system, where you invite migration kind of based on merit more selectively, which might be perceived as a way of making migration more palatable, politically speaking? Is that effective? Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the second one, the point system. I'm against it. It's skimming the cream off the milk. We all need immigrants. We need immigrants for labor, for paying taxes, and for creating a fairer society. The thing I can't understand about the whole immigration debate, I mean, I can understand uneducated, sort of left behind working class voters in Britain, notably in France, Germany, who are looking for somebody to blame and who feel that their job has been stolen at a time of labour shortages. What I can't understand is that governments have not understood that there is such a dynamic of immigration. You need people to bring into your schools. You need to fuel your education system with people. I mean, one of the sadnesses in Germany at the moment is that they are closing something like 1/6 of primary schools, and before long they'll be building up to secondary schools as they get there. You need to build more houses. When I was a young reporter on the FT, I was always told, they sort of drop you into some country you've never been to, and you were meant to sort of come back with a sort of rounded picture of what was going on there. And they used to say, Giles, look at the housing starts. It's a quick, simple way to see what's going on. Housing starts, new building, where the construction industry is going. And the construction industry in Europe has been going backwards since about 1965. So all of these things, I believe, are things that left of centre political parties should be focusing on. These are the bread and butter of a civilized society. And I find that instead, I think a lot of the reason that social democrats have been losing ground is that they've got involved more in a culture war, which is doing no good to anybody particularly. And if it's bad in America, it's just as bad in Europe. I think we caught the cold from America.
I think Social Democrats very often are afraid to raise the issue because they see it as an issue of the far right, and they're not ready even to acknowledge challenges which are real and have nothing to do with racism. Somebody from Germany told me that she came from a small town of 1,000 people. And in 2015, when there was the migration crisis in Europe, 500 immigrants arrived in her town of 1,000 people. So you can imagine for social services, hospitals, and so on. But because the issue is so sensitive politically and so much associated with the right, the left are afraid even to talk about the issue. And therefore, I think they lose support because it's as if they haven't heard what the preoccupations are of the voters. Just a personal comment. Yes, please, in the center here. Yeah.
Hi,
Yeah, just wait for the microphone.
Hello. Is that good?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm Jordan. I'm a Maya student. I was wondering what you think of some of the proposed solutions. This demographic, just because as you know. Oh. Is it on? Oh, I'm not close enough. Sorry. I would call it anti-humanism, but there's like a techno-futuristic solution to this problem proposed through AI, automation. And I don't think that solves maybe the wage gap you were talking about, but I wonder what you think of that proposed solution by that political part. And then furthermore, maybe UI as then an answer to that kind of automation and so on. So what, just maybe your thoughts on those two proposed ideas.
If you have a smaller workforce and you want the economy to grow, the smaller workforce has to be more productive. I always quote a rather well-known American economist who just died, in fact, called Bob Solow. And there's something called Solow's paradox. And Solow said, everywhere I look, I see the digital revolution, except in the productivity figures. And this is the problem with AI and the whole unknown digital thing. I mean, I'm not a great fan of AI because I don't like what I can't understand. And as far as I can understand, nobody understands. But what we do know is that AI, and indeed the whole digitalization process, is polarizing society. So a small group of sort of techs and nerds and what have you, they're fat and happy, and the rest of society is being left behind with a dwindling share of the economic cake. So until we come across some sort of digital technology that is actually going to close the gap, bake a bigger economic cake, not more profits in Wall Street, but more jobs, more consumption in Main Street, then I'm happy. But until then, I'm not impressed by AI, and indeed actively hostile.
Well, it's the very early days, and I've been trying to get the students to use AI constructively, and I do think there are certain constructive applications, but there are also many, many challenges for sure. And I just remind those following online to put their questions in the chat box. Yes, here on the right.
Hi, everyone. Okay, it worked. So thanks a lot, Mr. Merritt, for the
Brief introduction.
Okay, sorry. I'm Lorenzo, second year Maya student. I have a question about the economic system, because I see that often when the population and the fertility rate problem is addressed, very few things are said about maybe that the economic system is no longer sustainable. In the sense that when we look at the broader data, yes, of course, Europe is a negative outlier as like other East Asian countries, but it's predicted that global population will peak within this century. And so that even now, even in African countries, we are starting to see that there are declining birth rates. So isn't there maybe a problem with the economic system as a whole, in the sense that it needs, in order to be sustained and to grow, such an investment in terms of resources by every worker, then these workers then don't have actually the opportunity to also take care of family.
Yeah. It's the question, isn't it? How do we adapt the market economy to a changing social structure, not only in Europe and America, but around the world? And I don't know the answer. And I don't know anybody who knows the answer. An awful lot of people whose views I respect are now saying, look, it ain't bust, but it ain't working. And anybody who says, oh, everything's fine, look at the equities, look at Wall Street, look at the stock markets, everything's fine. It's ludicrous. That's not what the economy is. It's a vital part, but it's not the economy as such. What we do know is that we somehow have to find a way of harnessing large economic enterprises, whether they're governments or corporations, because governments are businesses too. We have to find some way of harnessing what they produce to what society needs. So we have to cut out shareholder value, or we have to reassess shareholder value in a very different way. How we do it, as I say, I haven't a clue, because every time I look at somebody's solution, I say, yes, but. And I think that goes for most people interested in this sort of problem. But we can't stand where we are. And I'm glad you mentioned Africa, because, I don't know where we're going on this. Within 20 years, 25 years, 1 person in 4 on the planet will be an African. And yes, it's true. You can, if you search really closely with your magnifying glass, can find a few places where the birth rate has slightly dipped because of middle class, Nigeria, Ethiopia, a few examples, Kenya. But basically, it's not the case. Africa today consumes as much electricity in a day as the entire state of New York. We've got to do something about Africa. We can't allow this huge and growing population to fester. This is the time bomb. Just to add to the problems, and I'm sorry, I'm no use on solutions.
And while our population levels off or declines, but for quite some time still, the African population will continue to increase.
Keeps on growing. Africa isn't the basket case that sometimes people make out. It's wonderful to see the way cell phones have transformed society in Africa, are transforming African agriculture. But the fact that some farmers can look at the Chicago futures prices on their phones is one thing, but always remember 7/8 of the agricultural implements in use in Africa is the hoe. Yeah, a hoe.
Other questions? Did I see a question towards the back there?
Yeah, thanks very much.
please.
Dan Morrison. I'm visiting from Washington. I'm an adjunct professor at Hopkins in Washington. Given what you said about intergenerational wealth, I'm curious, given that traditional methods aren't working, in your research, I haven't had the pleasure of reading your book, but in your research, have you come across any creative ways or ideas out there for intergenerational transfer of wealth?
Yes, I mean, I was asked about UBI and forgot about that. I mean, there have been a few good examples of UBI. Everybody knows about UBI, right?
And a couple of will.
Universal basic income. The idea that if you, in some cases, give younger people a lump sum, or in other cases, you give an agreed minimum income, so on and so forth. There have been a few cases where it's looked rather positive. The trouble is, in the first place, UBI cuts across what most people in the post-communist era were brought up on, which is, as my grandfather used to say to me, those who don't work don't eat. We've all been brought up on the idea that you get what you deserve. You work hard, you get a reasonable chance. So the idea of UBI, where your taxes are then sort of sprinkled around evenly across the population, I think is as much a cultural barrier as it is a practical one. And as I say, the UBI comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And actually, one of the better ones was being in Northern California, Sacramento, I think. But by and large, these have been test tubes, not nothing larger. So, sure, let's work on the idea, but I can see an awful lot of cultural and therefore political resistance before we get anywhere close. That said, intergenerational fairness has to be addressed. We cannot continue with my generation having pulled all of the blanket to our side of the bed.
But I mean, for example, through the fiscal system, things like higher inheritance tax, or indeed inheritance tax. Is there no inheritance tax in Italy? Or in any event, I mean, are there adjustments to the fiscal system or other ways of sharing this wealth, which you depicted as being so disproportionately concentrated in the hands of older voters, older people? After doing the research for your book, did you come up with the thought that in the fiscal area, for example, there are reforms that could be introduced?
Lots of ideas. I mean, some inheritance tax is one thing. And inheritance tax is difficult because the people who've got the money,
Don't tell my kids I mentioned that.
the people who've got the money say, right, we earned it fair and square. Surely it is a human right to hand it on to our own children rather than to give it to government to decide. You can understand that. But on taxes, there's so many things you can do. I mean, the most obvious one that I find so annoying is taxes on housing. Don't tax the houses, tax the land. Tax the land that a skyscraper stands on. and so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of things. The problem with tax is tax codes grow like topsy. They're bigger and bigger and bigger because tax lawyers put a bit here and a bit there, a bit there. It gets bigger and bigger and more complicated. And it's a Gordian knot you need to slice. But summoning the political capital, the courage to do that, very difficult. You've got one more.
Yes.
Finger with the back.
Other questions? There, you can see. Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is William, MIPP student. So you mentioned how we've got this burgeoning elderly population and we need more people to come in to fund a large non-working percentage of the population. How can we do that by bringing in more tax obligations? And what an example of this is in 2018, Denmark had a study showing the tax contributions and recipients of people from various parts of the world. They classified a category as Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and Turkey. And for that category, not anywhere in their peak earning years from their 40s and even their 50s did that group as a whole contribute. Rather, they were tax recipients. If we're bringing in large numbers of people from these societies who are tax recipients, how can we expect this to help our economy?
Absolutely. I mean, I've forborne to say that quite a lot of the solutions, or at least pathways to solutions, can be found in Northern Europe, mostly Scandinavian countries. You know, I suspect, I don't know, I think it's cultural, semi-religious. I think that the way Scandinavian societies developed during the 19th century made them culturally much more open to and more flexible on solutions of this sort. And of course, cultural is the problem. Just saying, you know, you ought to be more like the Finns, who have the best education system in the world. Or you ought to be more like the Danes, who have been more realistic and more adaptable to things. Or the Swedes, who tried very hard to integrate migrants and sprinkle them out beyond Göteborg and Stockholm. But all of these things boil down to cultural resistance. So what is needed, I think, is basically down to your generation of policymakers and decision takers to start pushing now for debate, discussion, for evidence, for facts. And until we start to have this European or Western discussion of how we are going to fix what has gone wrong with well-intentioned policies that were basically initiated in 1944, 1945, Bretton Woods, UN San Francisco Conference, so on and so forth. Until we start to have that discussion, we're not going to go very far.
A question online, quite apart from what we've been talking about in terms of migration and populism, isn't migration a short-term solution in that migrant populations quite quickly begin to follow the pattern of lower births and so on of the indigenous population? So the question is whether this is not just a temporary boost, so to speak, but not a solution beyond perhaps a single generation.
It's certainly true that if you don't have a high infant mortality rate, the fertility rate begins to drop, right? So the origin of big families is a lot of deaths in the family, okay? What you say is right, Michael, that my immigrant populations will be less fertile and have fewer children as time goes by. I don't think that's the root of the problem. I think the root of the problem is not enough housing. You're not going to have large enough families until younger people can expect at a reasonable proportion of their income to have somewhere decent to bring up children. You're not going to have it until they have a good working wage that permits them to suffer the expense of a family. And I think those are the key elements. Where we go eventually on the fertility of immigrant families, I don't know. I think it would actually be quite a slow transition, and I think it would be slower than the rate of cultural integration. I mean, I do think that for all the hoo-ha, all the nonsense that's talked about immigration in Europe and now in America, the reality has been in both America and Europe, these people have been integrated into society at incredible speed. I mean, I'm very critical of the fact I live in Belgium. I've lived in Belgium for ages. The Belgians brought in a whole lot of people, mainly from Morocco, and they didn't house them well, and they put them into not good schools. And we know immigrants are not privileged. On the other hand, there's a whole new generation of formerly Moroccan, Belgian politicians. The immigration minister is a Moroccan ethnically, and he's much more right-wing than I am. So, I mean, I think we don't do ourselves enough credit with the speed with which we've been able to cheerfully absorb immigrants of different races and religions. I wanted, if I may, before I forget, I wanted to make a pitch. I negotiated with the publishers of this book half a price thing for science students for the online version. So if there's a QR code thing, do that. It basically will cost you, I think, about €7, €7 or €8. A couple of cups of coffee.
It's a bargain. It's a bargain.
And then you have all my hard work on facts and figures at your fingertips.
Well, I already have my copy. I'm sure others will be tempted as well. Any other questions, suggestions, comments? Yes, Professor Plummer.
Michael Plummer, I'm a professor here and I'm an economist. My question is more political, however, but I am onomastico, so be gentle with me, please. Absolutely right when you note that you've had all of these difficult government decisions poor government decisions that led us to where we're at. We have this great short-termism. A lot of the questions that you answer, these problems, all have a policy solution to them. And is how do you have a political solution to actually address those issues? I mean, there's a great public choice problem. I mean, why are these pensions? Why were they way too generous? They're way too generous because if I make a decision now that doesn't pay a real price for 20 years from now, I'll make it every time, right? That's why we had such a generous system here in Italy and elsewhere, right? So I'll do that. And I won't address difficult problems, or I'll raise debt, right? So the next generation can pay it. I won't deal with climate change. Why should I have to do that right now? But, eventually it's important to pay the piper. So I guess my question would be, is you've got a set of essentially mainstream parties, political parties. They may have alternated from the left to the right of various streams, but longer term, parties that are there for the longer term that have failed to really take seriously these challenges and look to the future. I mean, what happens when we all become more populist? And what's happened in the US, what's going on in the UK, and elsewhere in France and Europe. I mean, what happens if we actually shift gears to go in the opposite direction than we need to go into?
If I may, quite a complex question. I could take two things. First of all, the pensions. They weren't generous when they started. Because when state pensions started, the idea was that you paid the pensions out of the profit put into the pension sort of capital pot. So they were sort of predicated on X billion Deutschmarks, French francs, whatever the hell it was, producing Y profits that could then be distributed to Z number of pensioners. So there was quite a decent pension. What has since happened on pensions is that governments, true to form, raided the piggy bank. Governments took the money that was meant to produce the profits for the pensioners and spent it on other things. So now we have pensions. They're not particularly handsome, but they're very expensive in terms of the government's, the state budget. So that's just one thing on the pensions. The wider political question, I think it boils down to how do we sugar the pill of all the tough measures that need to be taken? How do we get European public opinion to swallow it? More or less. Well, I think we have to look at where we are. The last 3 months, I think, have brought home to an awful lot of Europeans where we are. That we could be bullied by a maverick administration in the United States. That we, the Europeans, the largest trading bloc, the most powerful trading bloc, could be dictated to by a president who didn't actually understand how tariffs work. This is demonstrated to European, certainly to the thinking classes, and eventually it will filter down. I hope. We have dug our own grave in Europe because we're hanging separately in Benjamin Franklin's famous remark. And if we don't hang together, we will continue to hang separately. And I think the only way to push forward in what is now a formidable array of awkward choices. And anybody who's interested in government knows politics, government is about least bad choices. That's what politics is. So we're confronted with this array of dreadful decisions in which nobody is going to be happy. And the only way I think we can push this forward is to explain to Europeans that if you want to be independent of bullying by any maverick thrown up by an absurd political system in the United States, then you must get together and do it together.
I think you're preaching to conversion about getting it together. For the rest, I think that would open up a big debate. You must come back and we'll have a debate as well about our faulty democracies. Some have one fault, some have another. But there's a whole other set of issues there that I'm sure in the course of the year people will be confronting in different contexts. We have time for one or two last questions if anyone would like to come in. Jordan again. Yes. Sure, go ahead.
So this is this is maybe a matter of what the audience of the demographic issue is. So like, is it universal? Because I have seen arguments that for the global South, this is simply the movement of history and development. Like this is the next coming up for the global South, is they're not facing the same fertility issue. And so how would you explain the significance kind of to like globally of this? Or would you argue it is an issue of just maybe Europe, East Asia, and North America?
Yeah. I mean, the unpalatable truth is that we who've been working at the sort of heart of the European project, and I'm only an observer, but
I take the blame. Yeah.
But we who have been at the heart of the European project have been the most dreadful hypocrites. Because for as long I went to Brussels in 78, the newspaper sent me there. I wanted to go to Washington. I'm very glad I didn't. But when I went there, the European project was presented to me as a global project. We were the leaders in development aid. We were the post-colonial responsible partners for emerging markets and blah, 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 blah. I mean, the truth is that we've done very little for the global South. We screwed them on terms of trade. You know, a Moroccan minister once said to me, the question is, do you buy our tomatoes or do you take the people to pick your tomatoes? You decide. We paid lip service to development, but in fact, the development budgets were always peanuts. We didn't invest in education in developing countries, notably Africa, and East Asia did. Look at the difference, you know. And I'll keep on saying, we've been backtracking since roughly the 1980s on the amount of effort. The wall came down. We did have a serious problem. What to do with the former Comecon countries? They were loose cannons. Some people in the commission wanted to keep them at arm's length or to keep them in a sort of subsidiary role. Luckily, we took them in, but it's required an enormous amount of resource, money, attention, political capital that could, maybe should, have been devoted to what we're now calling the Global South. I mean, I think the Global South is a bit of a misnomer, a bit of a red herring. You know, on the other hand, low-hanging fruit for the Chinese, and even for the Russians, establishing security presence in Central Africa. Yeah, you get what you pay for, and what we're getting is the result of our negligence, and as I say, of our hypocrisy.
Well, a tremendous amount of food for thought there, Giles. Thank you so much for all these thoughts, for being so generous with your time and answering our questions so fully. I know I'm going to come back to a lot of these issues in my course next semester, and I'm sure these questions will be popping up in many of the courses that students will be taking here in SAIS. And I think after your presentation, they'll be well prepared for it. So thank you very much indeed. And I do hope you'll come back to Bologna before long. Thank you. Brilliant. Very good. You need to sign that. Just sign it. Don't worry about it. Sure. 5, 10 minutes. Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Right.